And so I've been in study mode and learning a new language and being able to read our scriptures in a new way. But it's nice to get a break from that and to just do something different. And so I promise you I will not read to you in Hebrew this morning, although my professor said I could read this text to you in Hebrew. I'm capable of it, but I will not do that for you. As we come to our scripture this morning, I would invite you to pray with me. Our gracious and generous God, as we do come to your word for us this morning, God, I pray that you would open our hearts, God, open our minds, God, open all that we are to you. God, we are so grateful for the signs of life that are around us, of new life coming into this community, God, of life and conversation and of being with each other. And God, we are so grateful for the life that you give us in Jesus Christ. So God, help us to focus in on you and the movements of your Spirit as we hear your word this morning. And it's in the name of Jesus that we pray these things. Amen. In September 2001, I led my first mission trip as a pastor. While I was not ordained, I was on the program staff of a large suburban church in the North Hills, and I was asked to lead a team of doctors and nurses to a remote village in Costa Rica. There we set up a makeshift clinic for the week, and we were treating diseases that come with having no running water or electricity in the village. Basically, there was a big river that flowed through the village where people did their bathing and their washing and their cooking. And I remember walking through the village for the first time and taking in our surroundings. And I immediately thought of the opening words of Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? And at the time, these were words of worship for me, as I was grateful for the opportunity to offer our gifts and abilities to those in the village, to bring real help and real hope, and to be on mission with God. But a few days later, I thought of those same words as the news of the events of 9/11 slowly made their way to our team. And if you could go back to that picture, I stepped outside of the clinic and I stared off into my surroundings once again. And as the pastoral leader, I was searching because our team was looking to me for care and direction amidst this crisis. And I said to myself, I lift up my eyes to the hills, and from where is my and our help coming? And those words have stuck with me from that time in such a powerful way. And over the years, I have asked this question many times, especially living in our city, which is surrounded by hills. But I found myself, particularly this last week, asking that question a lot as it resounded around in my being, as I listened to the stories and the commentaries coming out of the events of last weekend in Charlottesville. For earlier this week, those events felt so close to home for me when threats of more violence emerged surrounding a planned rally in Bakery Square at the Google's offices in the East End. It's a mile from my house. It's where my gym is located, and it just felt so near. And while that rally has been indefinitely postponed, our city this week responded to that by gathering together to promote peace and to pray, in a way to lift our eyes to the hills and to ask, where is our help coming from? I was reading about the prayer for Pittsburgh rally that happened downtown on Friday afternoon. My mom had the opportunity to go down, and she was sharing some thoughts with me. And I was really struck by a story that was in the Post-Gazette in response to that prayer time. the author of this article writes, was describing a young man, Paris Wright, who is a youth minister at age 22, who used his lunch break from a campus ministry to ask Pittsburghers a simple question on Friday: "May I pray for you?" He made the offer in silence, bearing the words across his black t-shirt and on a white sign along Grant Street downtown. And over, strangers gave Mr. Wright the go-ahead, a spiritual end to a week fraught with fear. He said, "Being a young black male in this city has shown me that there are moments where people are going to be targets for their appearance or identity," said Mr. Wright of Garfield, who joined several hundred others at the city-led Prayer for Pittsburgh, Prayer for Peace outside the City County building. And then he said, "We'll all get by so much easier by showing each other love." And I was just really struck by that quote. What does love look like in our day today? Where do we find the courage and strength that is needed to live in our world today? The article goes on to say that for about an hour at midday, speakers from across the community echoed that same idea in words and in music. And I thought about the Psalms that are the ancient songs of the people of God, the songs that help them express what is going on in their life at that moment. And I was particularly drawn, once again, to Psalm 121. So as I read these words this morning, I invite you to hear them in a fresh way and to see if the Spirit stirs something within you as you hear them this morning. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The Lord will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. This psalm, Psalm 121, is a song of ascent. The Songs of Ascent are a clearly marked collection within the Psalter comprising Psalms 120 to 134. And the noun ascents, I'm going to get a little Hebrew geeky on you, is translated from a Hebrew root word meaning to go up. And it describes the people of God going up to Jerusalem to worship. And so at the beginning of this collection of songs, of these psalms, it's possible to look at Psalm 120 as a song of longing for the peace of the city of Jerusalem. Psalm 121 is a song of moving towards Jerusalem. And Psalm 122 is a song of the arrival in Jerusalem. So these psalms are therefore also known as the pilgrimage psalms. I'd like for us to think a moment about the movement in these songs of ascent. The longing for peace, the moving towards, and the arriving and being present. For the ancient Israelites, these songs were sung on pilgrimage to the three great feasts that God gave God's people in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, times when they were to gather together to worship their God. And these songs were also sung by the exiles who were returning to Jerusalem after their captivity in Babylon. What are our songs of ascent today? What songs express for us our longing for peace, our moving towards, and our arriving and being present? I think this is one of the reasons why many of our worship gatherings include singing. They include song. For song expresses something deep within us. And even this morning, as we sung the song, as we began our worship, here I am to worship. This acknowledgement that I have come from somewhere, I am now here. I'm here with all my longings and all my desires. And God, here I am to be with you and to be with others. These are our songs of ascent. And Psalm 121 has a liturgical flow and structure. We used it this morning for our call to worship. And this psalm can be seen as 4 two-verse sections with an introduction in verses 1 through 2, and then the body of the psalm in verses 3 through 8. And so this structure will help shape our reflections on this psalm this morning, to share a little bit with you of behind the scenes of this psalm and what it may speak to us today. And these reflections will be around the themes of help and keep. The introduction of Psalm 121 is set apart with the use of first-person pronouns, I and my, and the theme of help. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. In verse 1, there are several potential understandings of what the hills may have meant to the people of God and what they may mean for us today. Hills could indicate a region of danger, perhaps the territory of bandits and outlaws, and therefore the question in the introduction is an expression of anxiety. God, I lift up my eyes to the hills. What is up there? Hills could also indicate a difficult climb and distress brought on by the pursuit of an enemy. And therefore the question in the introduction is also a cry for help. God, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Please help me be safe on this journey. The most widely held understanding is the hills as the hills surrounding the Jerusalem, the place where God is in the midst of God's people in a special way. God resides in the temple, and yet God is not contained by the temple. And as the pilgrims journeyed towards Jerusalem, the songs of ascent were songs of worship. They were songs of hope and anticipation of drawing nearer to God. And so therefore the question in the introduction is placed in a joyous and celebratory setting. I lift up my eyes to the hills. I'm hopeful. I'm excited. But my Old Testament professor at PTS, who's my current professor for our intensive summer Hebrew class, Dr. Creech, he proposes an additional interpretation of what hills may mean. He says that hills may refer to the hilltops around Jerusalem where shrines of other gods were located. He says in this case, the answer to the question in the introduction is a resounding, not from the hills. My help doesn't come from the hills. My help comes from the maker of heaven and earth. And he says this confession declares that these other false gods are ineffectual and not true gods. And he supports this by suggesting that the next few verses compare the God of the people of Israel to these other deities of the hills. He says behind verses 3 and 4, and the affirmation that the Lord neither slumbers nor sleeps, is the belief that the gods of neighboring people slept or they died during the winter months, and then they were revived during seasons of growth and harvest. So they were only partially around and awake. In verse 5, the shade given by the Lord can mean the safety of the temple, and it hearkens to God as the King of all. And behind verse 6 is the thought that the sun and moon represented gods. For example, the Egyptian god Ra, the sun god, and the Mesopotamian god Nana, the moon god. And as I was thinking about that this week, these ways that we have false gods in our world, I was actually struck by verse 6 as I'm reading so much about our preparations and our festivities around the total eclipse tomorrow, and how people are rearranging their lives to see the sun and the moon. Do we do the same for our worship of God, the maker of heaven and earth? And Dr. Creech proposes that Psalm 121 is a confession that Israel's God is the true God, the one God who is the maker of all. So when we say, I lift up my eyes to the hills, what might those hills represent for us today? Areas of anxiety or distress? Areas of hope or anticipation? Or areas of false and ineffectual gods that we have in our lives? Other places where we turn our eyes in times of need. And Psalm 21 encourages us to say, my help comes from the Lord, who is the maker of heaven and earth. And this declaration of who God is became a significant confessional formula by its use in the early creeds of the Christian church. If you're familiar at all with our book of confessions, both the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed begin with the words, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth. And the Christian church also came to understand this psalm as a witness to God's providential care of God's people. For the body of the psalm is set apart with the use of second-person singular pronouns, you and your, and it has the theme of keep. This word keep is repeated 6 times in these verses. Repetitive use is significant in our scriptures. And one commentator even points out that verse 5a, which says, the Lord is your keeper, is preceded and followed by exactly the same number of syllables. So in this song of poetry, this phrase is the center of the psalm. The Lord is your keeper. I was reading through our book of confessions this week, and I was looking at the different ways that our confessions express this idea of providence, of God's providential care. And it's a theological concept that has been questioned, actually, in our recent centuries in the face of war and suffering and violence and evil. And the question is, how could God allow this to happen in God's providence? And I decided not to wade into that with you this morning from our book of confessions, but I decided instead to share something that I wrote for a pastoral care paper as I was thinking about God's providential care. And I was referencing a description by Dallas Willard. And Dallas Willard says that God's keeping, God's care, can be described in 3 little words: for, with, and in. God is for God's people, protecting and guiding, delivering and restoring. God is with God's people, celebrating and suffering in their living and in their dying. And God is in God's people, animating and gifting and empowering and uniting. And we can see God's keeping in the long arc of the story that God is writing from the creation of the world to its consummation. That God is keeping, that God is caring for all of God's creation. Someone surmised that this psalm is most likely recited more than any other psalm from the Psalter, except for Psalm 23. And it may be because this psalm reminds us of the constancy of God's care through all of our life circumstances. And it offers words of assurance amidst the trials and the hardships of our lives. This reminder of God's care gives us courage and strength to live in our world. And it also invites us to play a part in God's keeping. For we can love others by caring for them. We can be for others by upholding the worth and dignity of all people and surrendering to their needs and concerns. We can be with others in seeking to understand their experiences and sharing in their sufferings. And we can be in the community of God's people, participating in our life together and placing our joys and sufferings within the larger context of this great cloud of witnesses, this people of God. For when one part suffers, every part suffers with it. And when one part rejoices, every part rejoices with it. And I think that's what you all were experiencing this morning. A time of gathering together before worship and participating in each other's lives, celebrating the new life that is coming. In a moment, we'll share prayer requests around what is going on in our lives that we need prayer for, and doing that together in community. And how can we continue to do that together in our little communities that we gather in, and then also be reminded of the larger communities that God has placed us in. I was reminded of this so powerfully this week in another article I was reading that quoted Reverend Richard Freeman, who is a pastor, a Baptist pastor in Braddock. Reverend Freeman is my supervisor at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and he's a 6'4" African-American guy. And it has been such a joy for me this past year to be in relationship with him and to engage in conversation with him and to just learn a little bit about his life story. And also on our chaplain team, we have a woman who is from like a Slovak background, and she's Byzantine Catholic, and to learn from her what life was like for her and what life is like from her, very different than me. And another one of our chaplains was a chaplain in the military, and to hear from her what that experience was like. 3 people who are very different from the background that I have, but it has been such a joy to participate in life with them. How can we do more of that? How can we come together more as the people of God to encourage one another and stand with each other? So this morning as we close, I'd like to read Psalm 121 again. And as I do so, I'd like for you to think about these questions. What are your hills this morning? When you're lifting up your eyes, are there areas of anxiety or distress? Are there areas of hope or anticipation? Are there areas where you are turning to something that is false and not lasting? Where are you in need of help? And how can you turn your eyes to Jesus and lift up your eyes to the God who is the maker of the heavens and the earth? And then the second question is, how is God keeping your life? How are you experiencing God being for, with, and in you this day? Or how might God be inviting you to be for, with, and in community with others? So keep those questions in your heart and mind as you hear these words once again. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The Lord will not let your foot be moved. The Lord who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. The Lord will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore.